And that was a little later too, which I think is a natural thing, suddenly we've got live.
Ringo Starr is one of the most beloved figures in music history. As the drummer of the Beatles, he helped define an era, keeping the rhythm steady while leaving a unique stamp on every song. Yet behind the charm, the laughter, and the iconic drum solos, there was one person in Ringo's life whom he genuinely despised, someone whose presence caused tension, frustration, and a level of animosity few fans would ever suspect. For years, Starr maintained his public image as the friendly, easygoing Beatle, rarely showing anger or resentment. Interviews, television appearances, and documentaries all reinforced the notion of a laid-back, peace-loving musician. But those close to him reveal a different story, that beneath the smiles and jokes was a man who harbored a deep, personal dislike for someone in the music industry. This wasn't a trivial annoyance or a fleeting quarrel. It was a serious, enduring hatred that shaped Ringo's interactions, decisions, and even his career in subtle ways. What makes this revelation so shocking is the identity of the person he hated. It wasn't a rival musician competing for fame, nor a critic reviewing his work harshly. It was someone far closer to the core of the music world, an individual whose influence, behavior, or decisions consistently clashed with Starr's values and patience. Friends and colleagues say that Ringo's feelings were so strong that he often went to great lengths to avoid conflict, yet the resentment never fully dissipated. The story provides a rare glimpse into the pressures and personal dynamics behind the scenes of fame. It is a reminder that even legendary figures, adored by millions, are human, capable of intense dislike, principled anger, and a willingness to set boundaries when someone threatens their peace of mind or integrity. For most of his life, Ringo Starr has been known as the calmest, most easygoing member of the Beatles. When tensions rose between John and Paul, when George grew frustrated with being overshadowed, and when fame crushed the group under its weight, Ringo was the one who kept the peace. He stayed out of drama, rarely argued, and almost never let anger drive him. That's why the revelation that he truly hated someone more than anyone comes as such a shock, especially because the roots of that hatred go back further than anyone realized. The story begins in the late 1960s, at a time when the Beatles were already living in a pressure cooker. Fame had stretched them thin, and their circle of collaborators, advisors, and so-called friends grew larger by the day. And then, into this world, stepped a man Ringo Starr would eventually grow to despise. A producer who believed he understood the Beatles better than they understood themselves. His name was whispered around Abbey Road long before Ringo met him. He was known for his controlling behavior, sharp tongue, and blunt criticisms, the kind that bruised egos and shattered confidence. Ringo, who had always taken pride in his drumming, became the target of the producer's unnecessary comments. The issue wasn't creative disagreements. Those were normal in the music world. The issue was the tone, the attitude, and the subtle way the producer belittled Ringo's contributions while praising everyone else. Witnesses recalled moments when the man would dismiss Ringo's ideas without listening, or make comments implying that the drummer was the least talented Beatle. Ringo hid his anger well, more than anyone else in the band. He understood the importance of keeping the peace, but those close to him saw what was happening. He would leave sessions irritated, quiet, withdrawn. His confidence, usually rock solid, began to shake. The tension grew even stronger when the producer attempted to push Ringo out of certain sessions entirely. He wanted a tighter sound and suggested using studio drummers instead. That crossed a line. Ringo wasn't just a musician playing in a band. He was a Beatle, an essential part of the group's identity. To imply he was replaceable wasn't just rude. It was insulting on a deeply personal level. John and Paul tried to intervene at times, but the damage had been done. Ringo felt targeted, disrespected, and minimized in his own band's environment. And when Ringo finally walked out during one recording session, leaving the Beatles temporarily drummerless, those who were there say the reason was obvious. He couldn't stand being around the man who constantly undermined him. The hatred didn't explode overnight. It simmered. It grew quietly. It became something Ringo rarely mentioned but never forgot. Even years later, Long after the Beatles had disbanded, Ringo avoided the man whenever possible. He refused to participate in certain projects he was involved in. He declined interviews that might bring their paths together. For someone as peaceful and forgiving as Ringo Starr, it took a lot for hatred to stick. But this wasn't just ego. This was about respect, dignity, and the right to be taken seriously as an artist. The early cracks in their relationship set the stage for one of the most quietly intense feuds in rock history, one that would evolve, worsen, and eventually shape key moments in Ringo's career. The tension between Ringo Starr and the man he despised didn't remain a quiet irritation for long. As the Beatles entered their final years together, the pressure around them intensified, and with that pressure came the most explosive moments of their hidden feud. By the late 1960s, every band member was dealing with personal frustrations, creative differences, and overwhelming expectations. Ringo, often the steady heartbeat of the group, tried to stay neutral, but this one individual kept pushing him to the edge. What had started as dismissive comments soon evolved into open challenges, public belittling, and a constant need to exert control over Ringo's work. One of the biggest flashpoints came during the making of the White Album. The band was already fractured, each member often working alone in separate studios. The producer, whose ego had grown alongside the Beatles' fame, became increasingly vocal about what he thought Ringo should play, or rather, what he shouldn't. At one point, he criticized Ringo's drumming so harshly that the usually calm drummer simply got up, walked out, and quit the band for 2 weeks. He later described it as one of the lowest points in his career. While fans assumed the tension was between the Beatles themselves, insiders knew the producer's cutting remarks were the breaking point. Not only had he questioned Ringo's talent, but he had also suggested replacing him altogether, a suggestion that deeply wounded the man who had held the band together for years. During Ringo's absence, the others tried to carry on, but even John and Paul admitted something was missing. They could layer harmonies, write melodies, and experiment endlessly, but without Ringo, the rhythm, the soul of the music felt wrong. When Ringo returned to the studio, the band welcomed him back warmly. The producer didn't say a word. He didn't apologize. Instead, he gave Ringo a cold nod, as if the drummer had overreacted. That coldness cemented the hatred. Even after the Beatles broke up, the feud continued to spill into Ringo's solo career. The producer tried to involve himself in post-Beatles projects, pushing his ideas and suggesting that Ringo should try to sound more polished, another backhanded insult implying he had never been good enough in the first place. Ringo refused to work with him. When asked privately, he would say, "Some people bring out the worst energy. I don't waste my time on that." The producer didn't take rejection lightly. He made subtle digs in interviews, praising other Beatles while conveniently omitting Ringo magazine articles at the time even quoted him saying that Starr could have been replaced by any decent studio drummer. Those words haunted Ringo for years, but the most painful moment came in the early 1970s, when the producer attempted to take credit for one of Ringo's most successful solo tracks. He claimed his influence shaped the song, despite having zero involvement in its creation. Ringo's team swiftly shut it down, but the damage was done. It was no longer just personal. It had become public. That's when the hatred transformed from frustration into something permanent. Ringo realized that this man not only disrespected him privately, but was now willing to rewrite history to elevate himself at Ringo's expense. From that moment on, Starr cut all ties completely. No calls, no collaborations, no reconciliations. To the world, Ringo Starr remained the smiling, peace-loving drummer who preached love and harmony. But behind that calm exterior was a man who had drawn a firm line, someone he would never forgive, never trust, and never allow near his legacy again. There are disagreements, and then there are the kinds of moments that carve themselves so deeply into a person's memory that they stay there for life. For Ringo Starr, one moment in particular became the unspoken line he would not cross again, the point where annoyance turned into something closer to real resentment. And the man at the center of it was Paul McCartney. To understand why that moment carried so much weight, you have to remember where the Beatles were emotionally in 1968. The world saw for young men at the peak of fame, but behind closed doors, they were exhausted, grieving, drifting apart, and silently competing for control. John was distracted, George was spiritually frustrated, and Ringo was the one trying to keep the peace. He always had been. During the recording of the White Album, tensions in the studio were at an all-time high. But the thing that cut deepest for Ringo wasn't the chaos. It was what Paul said to him during a session for Back in the USSR. Paul, being the perfectionist he was, decided he didn't like the way Ringo was playing the drums. He didn't. He walked into the studio the next day and told John and Paul, "I'm not playing. I'm leaving the band," and he meant it. Ringo left London completely and flew to Sardinia with his family, staying on actor Peter Sellers' boat just to clear his head. While he was gone, the band didn't collapse, which hurt even worse. They went on recording without him. Paul carried on with more tracks. John shrugged it off and added his guitar parts. George quietly wished someone would notice his frustration too. For Ringo, the message was clear: the Beatles could live without him. But he wasn't sure if he could live with that. Yet something unexpected happened. During his time away, he received a telegram from the remaining Beatles. It simply read, "You're the best rock and roll drummer in the world. Come home." Ringo later admitted that he cried when he read it. It was the first time he felt valued in months. Still, even after he returned, even after the flowers they had placed on his drum kit, even after the apologies, the sting of what Paul had done never fully disappeared. Ringo forgave him, yes, but he never forgot. That incident changed the dynamics forever. It made Ringo more guarded and made Paul more aware of the weight his perfectionism carried. And though the band continued recording masterpieces together, there was always a slight distance between Ringo and Paul. They were still family, still partners, still bound by history. But a line had been crossed, and decades later, when Ringo was asked about the lows of the Beatles' breakup years, he didn't mention the fame, the pressure, or the rivalries. He mentioned that moment. The moment where Paul made him feel small, the moment where he realized love and resentment can live in the same heart, the moment that proved even the most legendary band in the world was made up of very human, very flawed men. And for Ringo Starr, that single action was the closest thing to hatred he ever felt for one of his bandmates. Ringo Starr has always been known as the most easygoing and forgiving member of the Beatles. He wasn't the one who exploded in anger, stirred up drama, or picked fights. If anything, Ringo was the glue, the calm center holding together three fiery, creative forces. But even the kindest heart has limits. And there was one man, outside of the Beatles' inner circle, whom Ringo Starr truly struggled to forgive: their longtime manager, Alan Klein. To understand why, you have to go back to the late 1960s, when the Beatles were slowly drifting apart. Money issues, artistic differences, personal relationships, everything was pulling the group in different directions. They desperately needed a steady hand, someone who could unite them, guide them, and protect everything they had built. What they got instead was a ticking time bomb wearing a sharp suit and a confident smile. John Lennon trusted Alan Klein immediately. Klein made big promises, flattered him endlessly, and convinced John that he could fix every problem the Beatles had. George Harrison and Ringo, exhausted by the endless business meetings, reluctantly followed John's lead. But Paul McCartney, famously cautious, refused to sign with Klein. And in hindsight, Paul was right. Within months, Ringo began to see Klein's true nature. The man wasn't interested in protecting the Beatles. He was interested in controlling them. Contracts became confusing. Royalties suddenly looked different. Decisions were being made behind closed doors. And Klein kept pushing John, George, and Ringo to isolate Paul, which only deepened the division in the band. For Ringo, this was heartbreaking. He wasn't a schemer. He wasn't political. He just wanted the four of them to stay united. But Klein had a gift for manipulation. He whispered to John that Paul was trying to take over. He told George that Paul didn't respect his songwriting. And he made Ringo feel like the only way forward was to trust him, even when something didn't feel right. When the Beatles officially broke up in 1970, Ringo finally realized the full truth. Alan Klein had been pulling the strings all along. The lawsuits that followed were even worse. Klein claimed to be cleaning up the band's finances, but was secretly funneling money in ways that benefited him. He had control of their publishing decisions, merchandise deals, and even their release schedule. The band members eventually discovered enough irregularities that they sued Klein, and he countersued them. The legal chaos dragged on for years. For Ringo, it wasn't just about the money, it was about trust. He had been loyal, he had been honest, and yet Klein played him like a pawn in a game he never wanted to be part of. What hurt Ringo most was this: Klein had used the band's emotional fracture for his own gain, and in doing so, destroyed the last chance the Beatles had of healing. When Klein was finally removed and the lawsuits ended, Ringo made no secret of how he felt. He later said he had never met a man who caused more damage with a smile, unlike John or George, who eventually softened their views somewhat. Ringo held onto the anger longer. He admitted that he felt Klein had robbed them, not just financially, but of precious years they could have spent working and laughing together again. And although Ringo rarely talks about hatred, fans noticed a shift. The same man who forgave Paul for stepping over him, who forgave John for cruel jokes, who forgave George for creative clashes, could not find forgiveness for Alan Klein. To Ringo, Klein represented everything the Beatles were not: greed, manipulation, and the willingness to exploit others' pain. And the saddest part, Ringo knew that without Klein's influence, the band might not have fallen apart when it did. In a career full of music, memories, and brotherhood, Alan Klein remains the one shadow Ringo Starr never fully escaped, the one man he truly hated more than anyone.